Senpai has finally noticed me. About a week ago, I received an email from someone representing Gacha Gacha Games, a recently created subsidiary of Kadokawa, which is currently credited as the developer of all the RPG Maker engines. They asked me if I'd be willing to take a look at a game they're releasing in a few weeks, and while them misspelling their own company's name in the email had me very confident that it was a genuine request, I was originally still planning on turning them down. That is, until I saw the trailer. Hearing this, I immediately came 37 times and decided that this game was the game for me. And after watching the rest of the trailer, I realized that the waifu potential this game has is immensely high, and also the combat looks like something I can clickbait. So, thus began my journey through Soaring Machinery. I should mention before we hop into my review that this is in no way a sponsored video. Gacha Gacha Games simply asked me to play their game, which means that if I look at the first few lines of the trailer and decide it looks like a Tower of God ripoff, I'm not breaching any contract in saying that. Anyways, so long as you first subscribe to the channel...
Jonah, how are you feeling?
That's a terrible question to ask. You really should be asking is, should you subscribe to ToastyTime on YouTube? And the answer to that one is yes.
What kind of videos do you make?
Really good ones.
Who's your favorite anime girl? There's so many, you can't tell.
It's an unanswerable question.
I think it's time we hop into the game. Soaring Machinery. I'm gonna just refer to it as SM from now on because not only is it easier to say, but it reminds me of the soft mommy milkers which are indeed present in the game. Anyways, SM starts by letting us select our difficulty, and it includes a very nice explanation of what increasing the difficulty actually does that doesn't leave things vague so you actually know what you're getting yourself into. More games should do this. I put the game on normal because I'm terrible at games, and we move on into the opening sequence, which is a dream sequence. But unlike most RPG Maker games, it isn't absolute shit. The text introduction is only 3 lines long, isn't just on a black background, and looking back on it now, it actually ties into later plot points pretty well. This is also where I'm called Master. We're then moved into a tutorial fight where I promptly fall into a hole because, like I said, I'm bad at video games. My first impressions of the combat were extremely positive, and save for the waifus, the gameplay is definitely the highlight of SM, which I never thought I'd say about an RPG Maker game. It's all on-map combat, none of that shitty turn-based stuff only insane people like here, and it's incredibly fluid and fun. The combat never really gets all too difficult, but it's really fun to watch and interact with. It's immensely engaging, your swings have real weight and sound great, and later on when we unlock our special moves, it really feels like I'm watching a fight scene from an anime. My main complaints are with the keybinds, but since you can individually remap every key, that complaint is completely irrelevant. Movement is really nice too. There are idle animations and animation changes when you sprint and dash. Movement is also omnidirectional, but I never had any issues with collisions, save for this one bug way later on in my playthrough which did actually force me to close and reopen the game. Jumping is really fun and is built into the combat system. You can jump to avoid attacks, and also do a jump attack for increased damage but longer swing time. The platforming is definitely the weakest part of the game, but it's not that terrible, and we'll get into it more later on. For now, let's exit the dream sequence. Yup, that was the whole dream sequence. It was like 2 minutes long, and we got some great characterization for our 2 starting waifus at the end of it. We now awaken on a ship, and I think it's about time I introduced you to those 2 waifus. This is Iris. She's a robot slave. This is Maria. She's a robot slaver. Technically, those joke definitions aren't actually jokes, but the story makes enough of an effort to sweep it under the rug that I'm just gonna follow suit. Look, despite having seen... Jesus, is it really that much? A lot of anime, I still don't really know how to talk about it. I guess ultimately we can describe this game's story and characters as rather generic. They all fall into some sort of trope. Iris is the wholesome naive one, Maria is the hothead with big goals, Mel is a tsundere, Orcus is edgy, and it goes on. Every character that's in this game I feel like I've seen in every mediocre anime I've ever watched, but despite that I still enjoyed the characters and even parts of the story. I mentioned this anime in my last video, so I'll use it again here. SM kind of reminds me of In Another World with my smartphone. There isn't really anything of substance or any of the story I can actually remember, but there are entertaining and wholesome moments peppered throughout. I shit you not, I've been sitting here for like 5 minutes trying to remember the plot of In Another World with my smartphone, and I, for the life of me, cannot. I swear to God. The only thing I can remember is like the main character had a massive harem that all wanted to fuck him, and then they all got married. That's all I remember. I don't know what the actual plot was at all. Someone help me. I don't remember the overarching story or many details about the characters, but I remember the emotions I had, laughing at the game's expense and smiling at the wholesome moments, and I think that's at least something. The game, at least, isn't completely forgettable, and while I don't think that should be the end goal, it works well enough when the story and characters are only really there to motivate you for the gameplay. So after looking back over this video's script, I had another thought, and I kind of just wanted to pop it back in here. I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but it feels like some animes are focused on promoting one single waifu, or on one single character. I was watching Darling in the Franxx, and even though I was literally just watching it, I cannot remember a single thing about it besides Zero Two. That show is made solely for Zero Two. Even if that wasn't the intention, that's how it came out. Maybe this is more an analysis of culture, like we could call it the waifu culture, where shows are focused more on promoting or developing characters over the story. I don't know, maybe this isn't an actual thing that exists, but as I've gotten more into waifus, that figure was $180. I can very easily see how people's affection for certain characters could kind of change the way a show is written, or even just the knowledge that people will get addicted to certain characters can change the way a show is written. Anyways, I'm bringing this up now because I feel like SM does this with Iris's character. Even though a lot of the flashbacks and story moments are focused on Maria and Mel, almost all of the characterization seems to go into Iris, or at least Iris is the only character whose traits I can really remember. Something similar actually happens in Darling in the Franxx. They spend a lot of time developing the side characters, actually dedicating whole episodes, but the fact of the matter is that the side characters just don't fucking matter. I'm only there for Zero Two, you're only there for Zero Two, we all only care about Zero Two. Like, within the confines of the show, the side characters matter, but within the confines of, like, anime as a whole, you're not going to remember them. Like, after the show ends, you're not going to remember the characters. I already can't remember any of the side characters' names. I just remember Zero Two and Hiro, the main character, because his name is very easy to remember and because I'm literally watching the show right now. I'm having a really hard time explaining this, but all you really need to do is take one look at the opening sequence for Darling in the Franxx, and you'll realize that the show's creators, if at least subconsciously, realize what I'm saying is true. I can hardly remember Maria or Mel, just like I can hardly remember any of the side characters in Darling in the Franxx, but I remember a lot about Iris, particularly that she fills many of the waifu criteria, just like Zero Two. So essentially, to me, it feels like SM is a game built around Iris and the gameplay. Maybe this rant is reaching way too far, but hey, I thought it, so I figured I'd say it. That's how this YouTube thing rolls. Even without this analysis, it's pretty obvious that the story isn't the main focus. While the voice acting is really high quality and the music gets me harder than Rim Hentai, there is exactly one moment of visual storytelling in this game. Besides that one moment, you're essentially lied to. They put JPEGs on the screen that are decently well drawn and usually alternate them out for whoever's talking, but that's it. There aren't any alternate expressions, there's no sprite work for cutscenes, it's just alternating, glowing JPEGs sat behind a bunch of text. The only thing that engages me in the cutscenes are the voice actors, and while they're doing their absolute best, it isn't enough for the modern youth with an 8-second attention span to keep from getting bored. This is the one thing SM missed from anime. They have the waifus, they have the voice actors, they have the music, and they have the writing, but they do not have the animation. I don't have any evidence to back this up, but going off of personal feelings, I'd say 80% of my interest in anime comes from the animation. Maybe higher. There's so much more you can do with drawings, infinitely more than real actors, and this incredible versatility in visual storytelling is what at least keeps me engaged in and coming back to anime. SM, however, doesn't give two fucks about this, and is resigned to just having different expressions in the tiny box and calling it a day. I may have gone on a bit of a tangent there. Where were we? Oh yeah. Boat. So we made it to this island, but what are we actually doing here? Well, you see, good individual, we've come to climb the Tower of Desire, which is very aptly named, for it is said that whoever reaches the top will be granted their deepest desire. Now you may be thinking this sounds a lot like another anime, but fear not, for the tower isn't actually here. Well, At least not yet. The story's not that subversive. The tower is gone because reasons, and we have to get 5 keys from 5 labyrinths in order to bring it back. This isn't a particularly interesting idea, but what is interesting is how it ties into the gameplay. Mechanics time! After you beat the boss of each labyrinth, you get their key. However, these aren't actually keys, but rather cores which Maria can jam up Iris's ass in order to get her a special ability relating to the element of that labyrinth. This game has the typical water beats fire beats etc. type systems. While you're allowed to challenge the labyrinths, which are actually rather straightforward and not at all labyrinths in any order you want, you're actually railroaded into a certain order because otherwise the boss fights will actually be somewhat challenging. This is fine. I like that the game forces the player to consider where they're going and sort of strategize, even if it's only really an illusion of strategizing. What I don't like is how everything you learn about the core elements becomes redundant for the final area and boss fight. I don't know, maybe there was a most effective element, but I certainly had no clue what it was and just picked the one that do biggest number through trial and error. The labyrinths themselves are designed fine, the mapping gets the job done and it doesn't look awful, although there are some tiling errors. The platforming is built on a system where you can run off of any ledge at any time, but if you actually do remember to press the jump key, there's enough time and ability to maneuver midair that most jumps are pretty easy. A big concern I originally had with the platforming was enemies getting in the way, but luckily the developers have intelligence and made it so while you're attacking, you're unable to fall off of ledges. Ultimately, the platforming's jank is offset by good design decisions, and with the ability to disable double tap dashing, which is on by default by the way, make sure to turn it off or you'll have a bad time, the only thing I can really complain about is my own incompetence. In the zones connecting the labyrinths, things are pretty standard. I actually completely ignored the enemies here and just Naruto ran past them and didn't have to pay for that until the very end of the game. Actually, I ran past nearly every enemy I wasn't required to fight and never once had to grind to make up for it until literally the final boss. It definitely did take me out of the mood of the scene to finally force me to grind right before the big emotional end of the game, but even then the grinding wasn't more than 15 minutes long, and with the combat looking like it does, it was plenty enjoyable. On normal difficulty, you earn money pretty quick, which is nice because items are rather expensive and you actually do need to use them, and the soul gems you need to increase your skills are decently common drops. Speaking of which, leveling in this game works in 2 ways. You have your actual level, which I don't actually know what it does, and then your soul gem meter, which every time you fill up, you get a crystal allowing you to install a new upgrade back at home. These upgrades are pretty boring, just stat boosts and 2 sword reach enhancer things, but hey, it follows the game's trend of being average, so I wasn't too surprised. What I do really like though is that there's these secret shrine things scattered throughout different areas of the game which contain puzzles. If you care to find these shrines and solve these puzzles, some of which are actually pretty unique, you forgo having to fill up your meter and just get a whole ass crystal right away for your snorting pleasure. Anyways, that covers most everything. The main loop of the game consists of going through a labyrinth, fighting debatably interesting bosses, getting a flashback at the end along with some character interactions back at town, resupplying on items, and going to the next labyrinth. There's also a boob loli and boring bitch who have a whole thing, but I don't want to spoil the very interesting story. Even once you complete all the labyrinths and the tower comes back, it's structured rather similarly to the labyrinths, although there is one really cool part. You see, this character named Mel and her automaton Orcus are essentially your tsundere rivals. They, or at least Mel, hate you and are competing against you, but underneath the surface we know they love us. Most of the flashbacks and character interactions revolve around Maria and Mel's relationship. Anyways, at one point in the Tower of Desire, you're running up half of the tower and Orcus is on the other. Orcus is controlled by AI, and while it isn't super deep, you do have to work together to make it through. You open paths for each other, you can see the other fighting, it's genuinely the coolest scene I've ever seen in an RPG Maker game. Then, when you get to the end of this segment, both you and Orcus have to fight evil copies of the other, which I promptly annihilated and which Orcus got wrecked by. This is a really cool sequence, and if the characters reacted to it in a way that wasn't just summarizing what just happened like a fucking YouTube Let's Player, it would undoubtedly be one of my all-time favorite RPG Maker scenes. The game tells its story through the gameplay. Through the gameplay you become connected with Orcus, because without her you can't succeed, and then at the end you're forced to fight a version of her who's being an absolute dick, which completely subverts what the player was expecting. Without a doubt, this is the best part of SM. Unfortunately, that's really it. After that scene, the game returns to its somewhat bog-standard story, and while the introduction of a challenge mode where you race to beat every boss as fast as possible after you beat the game is nice, it wasn't enough to keep me playing. As I've mentioned throughout this review, SM is ultimately an average and forgettable game. It took me about 6 hours to complete, and it's good for some laughs, for some wholesome life lessons, and for some decent time-wasting gameplay, but when I'm laying at my deathbed, it won't be the game I remember. It's not bad, but with the wealth of incredibly good or so bad it's good content that's out there, there's better ways you could spend your time. It has some unique ideas, and some impressively smooth combat for an RPG Maker game, but I'm judging this game within the context of all games, not just RPG Maker. I also unfortunately can't give this game a final score because I don't know how much it's gonna cost, and I'm too scared to ask. So I give it a rating of 6 big boobs over 10 small boobs, because that's about how the math works out, and ultimately, that's what matters in life. Boobs. Yeah, that's a good way to end the video.
Thank you.